Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Stephen Shapin, who is Professor Emeritus of the History of Science at Harvard University, and also the author of, well, a whole bunch of books. I think it was your first book, Leviathan and Air Pump. Was that the first one about Hobbes and Boyle?
Yeah, it was with co-authored with Simon Schaffer.
Yeah, and then we have this one, Social History of Truth, which is now, I guess, about 30 years old. This one, The Scientific Revolution, which is, fantastic. I mean, it's amazing what you can pack into 200 pages. It's got so many different little nuggets that might make you want to go and explore other things. But then we also have a collection of essays called Never Pure, Historical Studies of Science, as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture, and society, and struggling for credibility and authority. I don't know how you got that title past the publishers. And then you got this one, The Scientific Life, which brings your history of science up to the present, more or less. And then this most recent book, which is not yet out, it's called Eating and Being, A History of Ideas About What We Eat and Who We Are. And I guess the alternative title is You Are What You Eat, right? Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Well, look, I really like this latest book because it combines a lot of my favorite topics, right? History, philosophy, and food, of course. And I can tell from the book that, you enjoy food and you see food as part of life and not something which is severable and containable. And it's also something which I think you have sort of a more old-fashioned view of the role of food in life, and don't seem to have been completely swept up by the kind of nutrition science approach which you describe. And I think, in this book, you do something very similar to what you do in the Scientific Revolution, which is to explore what's changed and what hasn't changed, and also what kinds of old ideas kind of reappear in a different guise in the present. And for me, it was fascinating to learn about dietetics and to learn that folks like Locke and John Wesley and Montesquieu, all of these people had something to say about food, and some of them even wrote entire books about food and what to eat and how to eat. It's really remarkable how food was really part of philosophy and medicine in ways that it kind of wasn't in later periods. So maybe we could start off with, this whole notion of dietetics, which seemed to be a really, really important part of medicine.
Yeah, the book is, it's a research monograph, but it's also an exercise in self-understanding, not just for me in particular, but for people like me. And the question is, how did we get to be like this? It's actually the first book that I've written, and it's not a genre that's well represented in modern historical scholarship. And that is a question that's sort of longue durée. How did we get here? Not as a triumph, not as a procession, not as a total rejection of the past for the bright modern present, but simply the question, how did we come to be who we are? That's an historical question, but I also, I eat 3 times a day when I'm lucky, and I wanted to understand how I thought, not as a historian, not as a intellectual, what you will, but how in fact do I think about food? And part of the question was motivated by thinking about my family and where I came from. And my mother would say things that were stock phrases, and I didn't quite know what they meant, or I repeated them without thinking much about them. She would say things like, I like spicy foods, but they don't like me. It doesn't agree with me.
Yeah, my grandmother used the same
What
phrase.
does that mean?
When she was talking about beans.
Exactly. Beans, precisely. Good topic. That should be the cover of my book, is the the Tuscan bean eater. But I wanted to understand both what is in fact modern about how we think about food and our bodies and ourselves, but also what persists, what kicks around among us today, what kicks around even with me. How do I actually think about tonight's meal? So the book is kind of framed like that. It is a research monograph, but it is a book that has how to put it, a non-specialist agenda, which is self-understanding. I mean, that's just clearing my throat, but the adventure for me was discovering how it is we came to think about food and ourselves the way we do, and how recently that happened, and how much of a supposedly past culture and way of thinking is still around, not just in the previous generation, but in ourselves. So that's the kind of thing it was. It was indeed an attempt to ask the question, how did we wind up as we are, and who are we? And food struck me as obviously vital to that. I mean, we may have concepts a couple times a week if we're lucky. We may reflect on rational method from time to time, but we eat 3 times a day. As I say, we're lucky. What do we think we're doing when we do that? What do we think food is doing to our bodies? What do we think, if anything, it's doing to our minds? So, as you said, the book could be considered as a kind of gloss on the expression "you are what you eat," because at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is what's the relationship between what we think of the stuff that we put in our mouths and who we are. And that, so there's a story about some quite recent changes in answering that sort of question. So it is not to be grand about it, but it's a story about how we became modern, and are we indeed modern?
Sorry, your connection is really, really bad, so you keep freezing up, and I can't hear most of what
Yeah,
you're
this
saying. So
this is probably at my end, but I don't know that there's
yeah,
much we can
well,
do about it.
we'll try to make it work, because we are recording everything you say, but I'm not necessarily hearing it. So if I say anything that seems crazy, just bear with me.
Yeah, I'm hearing all
So
of
I mean, I
you.
think that one key difference between kind of the ancient way of thinking about food and the more modern way of thinking about food is that eating was a part of moral life, right? There were moral elements to it, and there were virtues associated with it, right? So it wasn't simply a question of health and nutrition, right? It was caught up in how to behave. You had to think about not just what was good for you, but what was good in a moral sense, right?
Yeah, that's one of the important strands that I tried to follow in the book. And as you said, the notion of diet and the form of, the widely distributed form of medicine known as dietetics really encapsulates that, because dieta, from the Greek, is not just stuff that you eat, not just stuff that you do to lose weight. The notion of diet expressed order in life, an ordered manner of living.
Regimen.
Regimen, another word, was hygiene. And so I'll try to indicate this. The scope of what counts as medicine was very, very broad. And as you say, it did take in what we now regard as areas of our lives that have nothing to do with medicine. For example, morality. What is it to be good? What is the relationship, I ask, between what is considered good for you and what is good? So in classic medicine, dietetics handed down from Hippocrates and Galen and in antiquity, through vigorous culture, through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the sense of diet was encapsulated by what were called the 6 things non-natural. these were the things that you were presumed to have under volitional control, that if you behave in the correct way with respect to them would constitute health. So it did include food and drink, but it also included airs, waters, and places, where you ought to situate your house, when you were to what was a salubrious environment, what sorts of winds and waters were good for you. It included physical exercise. Was tennis good for you? Was walking good for you? Was horseback riding good for you? It included what were delicately called evacuations, which included not just urination and defecation, but also sexual release. And it importantly, it included sleeping, how much and how you ought to sleep. And it included, this is really a mark of the pre-modern, the passions of the soul, or the emotions. We tend to think that the emotions are something that work on us, and indeed it was understood that the passions of the emotions worked on you in antiquity and the early modern, but also that you should manage them, that someone in charge of your way of life, a physician, could give advice on all of these things, including the advice to take control of your emotions, to not to brood unnecessarily, to not give way to anger or lust. And the kind of advice that was given was stable for many, many centuries. And it's really interesting. It's interesting in as much as it's really boring, and that is, observe moderation. Nothing too much.
Balance, right?
So, yeah, don't eat too much, don't eat too little. Don't sleep too much, don't sleep too little. Take exercise, but not too much. Don't be sedentary. Don't have sex a lot, but don't never have sex, and so on. And that makes this culture of dietetics, which I'm trying to say is really vital, not just to intellectual life, but to civic life and moral life, for centuries rather boring for historians of ideas. And I count myself, amongst other things, an historian of ideas, because nothing interesting is happening. Observe moderation, not too much. Know yourself. Take an inventory of what you are like, what foods have what effect on you. I find that actually very, very interesting, because it means that the culture of dietetics had a relationship between the good and the good for you, the instrumental and the moral, which we say is substantially gone in modernity. And a classic expression of its disappearance is contained in the idea of the naturalistic fallacy. You can find it in moral philosophers like G.E. Moore, and you find it expressed by Max Weber in the early 20th centuries. You cannot get from an is to an ought.
Are you there?
In other words, you cannot get from the scientific to the moral. But it's precisely the occupation in dietetics, in what counts as scientific medicine of past centuries, that place the is and the ought on the same field. So that what was good for you, what would guarantee health and long life, also constituted virtue. Moderation is temperance, is virtue. It's one of the 7 cardinal virtues. I found it tremendously interesting. So I found myself telling a story about, in a way, about how we think about food and ourselves, which is also a story about the modern moment.
Up your thought, and I'll just jump right in and say, so I mean, eating, I mean, all of these non-naturals, they're within the province of virtue, right? I mean, the whole idea of gluttony as a vice, right? Immoderation as a vice, and so this was sort of this view, this dietetic view is one that was consistent with Greek notions of moderation and balance, but also Christian notions of virtue and vice, right?
Exactly. That made dietetics in this pre-modern conception of medicine, dietetics, hygiene, regimen were central to what medicine was. It meant that the physician gave advice over a great span of your life, not just doing your appendix or dispensing your Lipitor. And so medicine is actually central to ways of being. It's not just about your body, it's about mind and body. It's about you in a way that modern medicine, shall we say, is not. That that attracted my interest. I mean, I also like areas that are so boring that no one else is interested in them. And dietetics, precisely because it hasn't got lots and lots of new ideas, because the ideas that were central to it are, shall we say, discarded, uh, hasn't attracted lots and lots of academic attention, and that inspired me.
But it seems also that embedded in this, there were two alternative views of authority, right? So, and this debate crops up later in your Scientific Revolution book. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like this whole dietetics view of the world is consistent with common sense, right? So, you know, if it if it tastes good, it's probably good, right? You should be able to use your natural sensibilities to figure out what's good for you and not. But then on the other hand, there's this whole authority, expertise around the humors and you know, which you have to be kind of educated in order to understand, right?
Yes and no. I I like to quote my Shakespeare, and that language of the spirits and the humors and the temperaments and the way of presenting people as people of a certain type, melancholic. Hamlet is melancholic. Hamlet is substantially written out of Timothy Bright's treatise on melancholy. Uh, the people, not just in the good seats, but in the pit, the groundlings at the Globe Theatre, might not read Greek or Latin. They might not be able to read English, but they understood this way of making sense of people. And they were able to recognize people of a certain type using these resources, sometimes pictorial resources of what people were like. It is the province of expertise. There was pushback against expertise in many respects, but it was not a restricted culture. It was a shared culture, even amongst the illiterate.
So this common sense though is sort of like second nature. I mean, you need to learn something about what's watery and what's hot and what's, you know, what's dry, right? I mean, I guess some of them are obvious. Like a melon is wet. Okay, great.
Yeah.
But some of these other things, I mean, they're not exactly intuitive.
No, I mean, the broad outlines of it connect scholarly judgments about food. So, for example, mustard, they would say, was hot and dry in the third degree. Garlic, similarly, radishes, melons, as you say, and peaches were cold and moist, sometimes cold and moist in the second or third degree. Now, the groundlings at the Globe Theatre would not know that, or they might say that's ridiculous. But they would have the basic categories that connected the qualities of things delivered by dietetic physicians to the apparent qualities of things on their plate.
So kind of in
There
this,
is that connection.
so kind of in the same way nowadays, the equivalent of groundlings today understand, you know, protein and carbohydrates and, um, you know, sugar and fat and stuff like that, right?
Well, precisely. I mean, the language of humors and qualities of foods is gone, replaced, as you say, by the language of constituents, proteins, carbohydrates, fats. And we do trade, all of us, the groundlings of the early 21st century, trade it's on the nutrition facts labels in our packaged food. Many of us may know what cholesterol is and whether there's good or bad cholesterol and so on and so forth. But there's a difference. And the difference is, as you said, the melon appears as cold and moist. We have no knowledge of proteins or carbohydrates except as the deliverance of expertise. And that too is an aspect of the modern condition. It's a disruption, if not a severance, between the sensory apprehension of the world and our uh, um, sense of what the world is really like. Uh, that too, I found extremely fascinating because that's a story about expertise and the relationship between expertise and common sense. So when my mother said that spicy foods don't agree with her, it's not a language that a physician would permit as a sensible way of talking about her diet.
Mhm. Now, they also had some idea that different people should get different diets. And then when people were sort of out of balance, you would kind of counterbalance that, right? With
Exactly.
different diets.
Yeah. So that if you were there was not just one way, one size fits all of being a balanced human being, because there were temperamental types. So a melancholic, for example, was someone in whom the humor of melancholy or black bile dominated. It was a kind of normalcy. Similarly, a phlegmatic person was a person in whom phlegm, the cold and the moist, dominated. It was another way of being normal. And each person should basically eat what they were.
Mm.
So if you were a melancholic person, your diet should tend towards the the cold and the dry. But illness was conceived as imbalance. And so if your natural tendency had gone to the extreme, which was a disease state, then you should correct it by taking in foods whose qualities were the opposite of your extreme pathological state. There's another way in which medical expertise was not just at your side, but on your table throughout the day in a way that medical expertise, for all its authority now, is not.
Well, then there's this other idea that, you are what you eat, right? So that the English got their unique character from roast beef, right? And the French, I mean, they used to make fun of the French as the frog eaters. I remember seeing some of those cartoons in the 18th century where, they depict these scrawny, sickly French people, eating frogs and stuff and not eating, and the big fat, robust,
Yeah,
healthy English people were eating roast beef, right?
yeah. John Bull, it's a famous Gilray cartoon, The Gates of Calais, showing a fat, ruddy Englishman with his great hunk of beef and a scrawny revolutionary Frenchman gnawing at a leek
Yeah, right.
garlic off in the side. But that's interesting because one can, and what stories were told about why, for example, beef, not just beef, but particularly roast beef, not more particularly English roast beef, made Englishmen the way they were. You find this in uh, Henry V, uh, when the French ambassador reports that the English are valiant, but they're now sorely out of beef and won't fight valiantly on the field the next day. Uh, there is another register that sat alongside the register of humors and qualities, and that is the foods you took, and especially the animal foods you took, would transfer the qualities of the beast into qualities of you. Now we think
It's like oysters
of
were
beef.
aphrodisiacs, right? Because of the way they
Yeah,
looked, right?
right. There's a story about beans too, by the way,
Yeah.
but we think about beef in terms of shrink wrapped steaks from a heifer. If you're an Englishman in the early modern period, think of a bull. Think of the working ox. Yeah. Uh, and the stoutness, the reason that bull baiting was a cruel sport in the period is that the bravery of the bulldog was pitted against the bravery of the bull. It was a kind of bull fight, Anglophone style. And so vegetarians, and there weren't many, but some early vegetarian sentiment argued against eating beef, animal flesh, and especially bloody animal flesh, because it would make you bloody minded.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the English in the chivalric age liked and wanted, at least the men, liked to advertise their bloody mindedness, the chivalric valor, which was fed by beef. Conversely, if you eat rabbit, you and you know how the argument goes, and it does, and so that's a transference of qualities. And so again, it's a way of thinking about our food and ourselves, which now here's the thing that fascinates me. I don't have much of anything to say about it at the end of the book. If you look at the distribution of vegetarianism in early 21st century culture, uh, you you'll find that the majority of vegetarians are women. Uh, if your Trumpist counter to the tofu eating, salad eating classes is bloody beef. So I'm not entirely sure this is an example of something that isn't a way of thinking which is said to be dead, but I'm not sure it is.
Well, it's interesting that there was such a massive amount of meat consumption in the U.S. in the 19th century, right? I mean, it was way higher than it is now, wasn't it? I mean, before the Italians and the Mediterraneans showed up on the scene to bring their pasta and so forth, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it
it
was,
was. I mean, English visitors, not just English visitors, but also continental visitors to the U.S. in the 19th century were appalled by the amounts of beef. As a matter of fact, continental visitors to England in the early modern period were appalled by the amount of beef. Now, beef eating wasn't as democratically distributed as English like to say it was, but it was more democratically distributed in the United States. I mean, beef was cheap, and there were enormous amounts of unadorned, bloody beef consumed and taken in rapidly. Uh, and so the Continentals would judge of Americans that they are what they ate.
no, in the
Still
scientific
do, by the
revolution,
way. Still do.
yeah, no, in the scientific revolution, you talk about the rise of the kind of mechanistic view of the world. And you said in this book that the mechanistic view of the world didn't really have much impact on the view of food immediately. It took a while, right? And so it was really more, was it really more chemistry? I mean, I remember reading about, Lametrie and Diderot, and they would talk about, how your body would go back into the soil and you were just made up of, the matter that you ate. But it was really only after kind of the chemists got involved that we saw the rise of this alternative view, right, of nutrition
Yeah.
science.
I mean, this is. I mean, I'd like to make lots of qualifications, but the uh, the adaptation of Cartesian and Newtonian views of matter in the world to food in the body has to be described as one of the failures
Mm.
of the scientific revolution. There were serious attempts to describe the qualities of food and the effect of foods in your body mechanistically in terms of quality less particles variously arranged, sized, and in various states of motion. They came to nothing by the end of the 18th century. And as you say, the intervention that left its mark indelibly on emerging nutritional science was chemistry, not the world of qualityless particles variously sized and arranged in states of motion, but the world that contained things like sodium and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and their compounds. This provided a language for talking about what was in food, what the constituents of food were like in terms of the qualities of these substances which did have qualities and characteristics.
Right. And so came with there was a guy named Liebig, right, who played a big role in this, right, in discovering this, what, osmazone is that? I mean, is that kind of, is osmazone, I guess I guess we would call it umami right now.
It's
Is that
umami.
kind of
I
what it
mean,
is?
we don't osmosome. There were great efforts by uh, chemical scientists to characterize what it was, but it was described in a way that we would now describe glutamates.
Hmm.
or the umami characteristic of foods in tomatoes, in mushrooms, and especially in meat. Uh, there was never there was no success in characterizing osmosome chemically, but everyone could recognize it when they tasted it.
Hmm.
And osmosome continues in cookbooks and in some extent in physiology textbooks into the early 20th century. Now it's gone. There is no such thing as osmosome. But fortunes were made. And you mentioned Liebig. Liebig was a great chemist, but he was also a great entrepreneur in the late 20th century.
I mean, the
So
company still exists, right? I mean, I don't
the
know if it's
company
been,
still exists.
yeah. Oxo part is one of their,
It's OXO.
yeah.
It's OXO, which is concentrated essence of beef, or in the 19th century terms, lots and lots of concentrated osmosome. So the trading cards that accompanied uh, Liebig meat extract, Lemco extract of meat company, the products showed bulls. You want to become brave as a bull, healthy as a bull, uh, if you like, as virile as a bull. Take a spoonful of oxo or bovril.
Hmm.
Uh, so again, it fascinates me how to describe the culture of what's called in Britain the beef tea,
Hmm.
the original of the restaurant, as many people now know, was named after a drink, uh, a restorative, which was a beef tea.
Mm.
Uh, and how this actually relates to the chicken soup. But there are cultures which shockingly do not value chicken soup
Hey, I
as a
just made myself
restorative.
I got sick last week. I made myself a huge pot of chicken soup, and I was reading that first chapter, and I was like, oh yeah, chicken soup.
So do I. So
Yeah.
do I. But the chicken soup has a similar story, but less commercialized than Liebig's extract of meat company, and that is the original chicken soup is the soup of a cockerel, as in coq au vin.
Mm.
That's to say, the essence of virility, male virility, and especially the cock's comb, the
Mm.
rooster,
Right. I
the
mean,
cock of the walk.
Chinese medicine still kind of leverages a lot of these concepts, right? You know, like the
It
rhino's
does.
horn, and you want to take that for virility because it kind of because of the way it looks and so forth.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So I hesitate to use the language of survival. I like more the idea that we live and always have lived in a pastiche of past and present.
Right. Who was it that said the past never died? It's Faulkner, right? It's
It's Faulkner.
still,
It's not even past.
yeah. Right. Well, I mean, so I think with the rise of this nutrition science, you say this is where kind of common sense now gets called into question, right? Because you can't see your vitamins in your food, and you can't, there's nothing intuitive about it. So you need to kind of check labels, and you got to consult with, your doctor. But in this case, your doctor is spouting things that are, you have to kind of go on faith that they know what they're talking about, right?
Yes, you do. But it is very interesting. So there is a there's a sentiment that I track through much of the book. In the fancy Latin form, it's quod sapit nutrit. If it tastes good, it's good for you. Uh, my mother would still say something of that sort. In England, they say a little of what you fancy does you good.
Mhm.
Um, Now, if there is a dominant sentiment, we would say something like, if it tastes good, it's probably bad for us.
Right, right.
And of course, the big food industry has become highly skilled, scientifically skilled at engineering the sweet spot of the fat, the salty, and the sweet so that it tastes good. They're very, very good at making things that taste good, which we now know through other forms of scientific expertise are bad for us.
Hmm.
This is the way we live now.
Yeah. Well,
But
I
we
thought
can't.
there's some interesting parallels with in the scientific revolution, right? Where the folks who are the proponents of direct experience, right, and the book of nature, they they warn that the average person, however, is without some guidance is going to, make some silly mistakes, like believing that the world is flat and so forth. And so you can't really rely on your direct experience.
Yeah, this is very much this. So one qualification we would say that expertise has tremendous authority over our senses and our tastes. However, there is pushback, and the pushback is as much a feature of how we live and eat now as, shall we say, McDonald's is. And the pushback comes under various names, but one is slow food.
Yeah.
I've been fortunate enough to teach short courses on the history of taste at Carlo Petrini's Slow Food University in Piemonte for a number of years. I know it's hard work, but someone's got to do it.
That sounds like a teaching job that I would like.
No, it's tremendously enjoyable. But Carlo Petrini, Slow Food, and people like Alice Waters will have none of this. Mm-hmm. Julia Child had none of this. And they will say things, experts disagree. What you read is good for you or bad for you. One week in the paper will be contradicted the next week in the paper.
There's a great John Oliver skit on the flip-flopping of nutritional advice, which is, I recommend it.
Yeah. But I think both of these features are features of the way we live now. I mean, you could tell a story about the way in which nutritional expertise trumps common sense sensory experience, as in we don't know cholesterol except through the nutrition facts label. We don't know what it does except through the deliverances of expertise. But that, as we're aura of expertise doesn't illuminate all of our lives. And there is pushback to that. And it's from people who said, we've had enough of this scientific inspection of what's on our plate. It's only a burger. And then people will say, and this includes Morgan Spurlock, who told you to supersize it? Who told you to have a Big Mac every meal of every day for 3 months? McDonald's, as we're now, owns that sort of rhetoric. The Big Mac is not poisonous. It can be part of, they say, a moderate, balanced, and varied diet. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I close the book with exploring the way in which this language of moderation now lives, if anywhere, it lives in the hands of the people who make food that is bad for us.
Well, that's one version of moderation, but the Michael Pollan sort of movement, the slow food movement, I mean, that also emphasizes a different type of moderation, but it's not an appeal to common sense. It's really just appeal to a different form of authority, right? The authority of tradition to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, Carlo Petrini likes to quote Wendell Berry's "Eating is an agricultural act." And so when you're eating, you have a mind to what's good for your body, insofar as you know what's good for your body. You might know it through past experience. You might know it from the nutrition facts label. You might know it from medical expertise. But you also have in mind what is good for conviviality. Mm-hmm. A nice meal with friends, have a drink. You don't have to get drunk, but have a drink every now and then. What's good for the environment? What's good for the agricultural laborers that produce your food? What's good for the people who package and transport your food? All of these belong in this pushback to the nutritionally modulated desire to consume only what's good for your body and live forever.
Well, you could argue they're bringing virtue back in, but I think that it's always been there. I mean, the people who, join Weight Watchers, they'll talk about feeling guilty, if they eat a brownie, right? And so virtue's always been there. It just sort of changes form.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I want to say. I mean, I would say because we don't have a repertoire. If you we ask ourselves or our students, what are the seven virtues? What are the seven cardinal sins? They won't do very well. They used to do a lot better, uh, but it is not gone in the sense that the moral engagement of eating is still with us. It, as you say, it modulates. It takes different forms, but it tends to be a finding. I write a book, and there'll be maybe if anyone reads the book, if anyone takes the message, would say, "Oh, I knew that all along." So it's the kind of message I hope to, as you were just doing, to remind people of what they already know or think, or the sentiments that they already have, because they become submerged in our official culture. Will say, you are what you eat, and people will say, yeah, if you take too much cholesterol, you get heart disease.
Mm-hmm.
These other registers for understanding the relationship between what we eat and who we are not gone, but they're submerged.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that you mentioned also that we live in an age of extremes, right? And so, we see the all grapefruit diet, right? Or we see, I mean, there are these crazy diets that seem to, flourish and gain popularity and then crash and burn, right? I mean, those sorts of things would presumably find a difficult time thriving in an earlier period, and certainly within the slow food movement, you would probably never see anything like that, right?
No, you never see anything like that. So I think the language of moderation has lost it's around as we were talking about it, but it's lost the enormous authority that it had
Mm-hmm.
in the past, and especially when regard what you're taking in as nutrient constituents rather than qualities. You can get to positions where protein is good for you. So let's have a lot of protein, or vitamin C is good for you.
Yeah.
And of course, with Linus Pauling, let's have mega doses uh, of, uh, of vitamin C. And I think the most influential recent expression of that is, of course, the Atkins diet, which celebrated excess,
Yeah, and
presuming that what you really wanted to eat was fat and meat. Eat luxuriously, eat as much as you want, and you will lose weight and therefore be a healthy person. Uh, that's a paradox of the relationship between health and moderation, which seems to become inverted.
mm-hmm. Well, I think there was an interview I saw recently with this tech entrepreneur who was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and basically eating pills and powders and then like nothing that looked at all like food in the goal with the goal of living forever.
Yeah, well, the techies are frighteningly committed to living forever, as we all been reading about in the papers. One hopes they don't succeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to turn to the scientific revolution because this book, I was rereading it, and it really does a fantastic job of not only defining what people thought they were doing during the scientific revolution, but also kind of offering a more nuanced description of what they were doing. And I think, you bring them back to this idea of revolution. So I think for most people now, they've forgotten the origins of the term revolution, which is sort of a return to something that once was. And everybody thinks it's a discontinuous break with the past. And I think that most people, when they think of the scientific revolution, they think of it as a discontinuous break from the past and, the replacement of the Bible with the book of nature. But one of the most interesting things I saw in the book is that these practitioners, they actually thought, many of them, that they were sort of restoring some original version of the truth that had kind of decayed over time or been corrupted over time.
Yeah, indeed.
Um,
I mean, that's you know, uh, when I was a graduate student, briefly in the history of science, this was the scientific revolution was the defining moment in history of science. It was at the same time, as you say, the moment that represented a rupture, a discontinuity, irrevocable discontinuity between past and modern present. It also, as it began, made the world better. It, and it represented a fundamental discontinuity. So when I was a graduate student in history of science, this was the subject. Science made the modern world. It made it in a moment. It was like putting on a new pair of spectacles, seeing the world in a different way. And it recruited, I don't think, as I came to think very successfully, the language of participants in the time, including Descartes and Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, that in the form of in the expression of Descartes, that he was going to forget everything that the Jesuits had taught him at La Flèche and build the house of knowledge with entirely new materials and an entirely new plan. And that was what modernity was going to be. To a large extent, that view of the instantaneous replacement of the dark past by the bright modern future in the scientific revolution informed notions of what that revolution was. I don't think the little book I wrote, although it has a notorious first line, actually says that nothing important happened and that Galileo, Descartes, Boyle, and Newton did nothing of importance. It was to say, as the introduction goes on, that the revolution advertises being putting on a new pair of spectacles of an instantaneous transformation of the past into the modern future is not a very good description of what was happening.
So is that was propaganda that many of them put out that we believed, or is that more a presentist kind of reconstruction?
It was widely believed, but at the same time, it sat together with this language you find very strongly in people like Isaac Newton, that the change in thought that was being brought about was a restoration of the pristine wisdom of the past, whether it was the biblical past or the past of Greek antiquity. That it was a restoration of that knowledge had been clouded, corrupted, and the task of the purifiers of knowledge of the 17th century included the restoration of that knowledge to its pristine original state. It's a kind of Protestant conception of what was happening in natural philosophy and natural history.
It was like millenarian, right? It was this idea that you're going to restore, right, some pre-lapsarian, paradise on earth before.
Yeah, Christ is going to come. Christ is going to come, and the end of time is nigh, just like us. It's biblical prophecy. Isaac Newton almost certainly wrote more words in biblical chronology and, of course, alchemy than he did in natural philosophy and mathematics. And I wanted not to do anything terribly original, but I wanted to produce a short book called The Scientific Revolution that honored all of those aspects, and especially that asked, what were they doing? I was not interested in writing a book about concepts and the transformation of concepts. I was interested in the transformation of practices, and including the practices of making credible concepts. I wanted to understand, what did you do to make scientific knowledge in its varieties in the 17th century? I wanted to make this story problematic and complex and textured, and I did so. And I wanted to do that for not for research specialists, but for people who want to know what was this thing that happened And I want to say something that, if said badly, makes your book unattractive, and that is, well, it's complicated. But
Mhm.
after all, that was what I wanted to convey as clearly as I could in, not very many pages.
So the idea that you could somehow achieve knowledge through direct experience with the world, I mean, it's a little optimistic, right? You need to have some frameworks and some theory, right, to make sense of the world.
Well, this is amongst the strands of early modern thought about nature. There was a strand that valued direct experience, and the role of experience and experiment is very different in the hands of people like Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke doing masses and masses of experiments with the air pump. It's rather different for people doing natural history and collecting information about the plants and the minerals in foreign parts than it is for a mathematical natural philosopher like Galileo or Isaac Newton. So amongst the things I want to do is there are various strands. There isn't a thing called science, which is one thing or another. Um, Descartes did not think that much could be achieved in natural knowledge by doing masses of experiments. Boyle did masses of experiments, confident that only by founding natural philosophy on a secure foundation of facts would progress be made. So I wanted to include these strands and the how to put it, the dialogue and the arguments between the strands to shake up a conception of there was this thing called science that had a revolution in the 17th century. I'd say much the same about the early 21st century. I don't much like the idea of the scientific method. I don't much like ideas that generalize about the nature of science. So it's I suppose it's a sentiment that you find in some other things that I've written. I don't much like essences. I like to know what people are doing.
Well, this guy Robert Boyle, I mean, we all know Boyle's law. I think that's probably the only thing I remember from chemistry. But I mean, I studied 17th and 18th century intellectual history, and Boyle didn't play a significant role. I mean, you read about Bacon, of course, and you read Descartes and Locke and Newton, but you have, I mean, Boyle comes up in your work over and over again as a really significant player. So what made Boyle such an important and influential person?
Well, the reason that Boyle didn't come up, I'm not surprised he didn't come up in courses on early modern intellectual history, is it's very difficult to find a concept associated with him, or even a clear methodology associated with him in the way that you can with Galileo or Descartes or Isaac Newton. He did, as you say, in a let me say a Baconian way, lots and lots of experiments. He was very judicious and cautious in drawing conclusions about the nature of physical reality from these masses of experiments. The one thing as you say, is Boyle's law, which of course is tucked away in these records of masses of experiments that he did. What is important about Robert Boyle? What is important about Robert Boyle, I think, and the group around Robert Boyle, and especially the group in the early Royal Society, is their way of advertising a secure philosophy of nature would be rightly founded on both an observational and an experimental register of fact. And in policing the boundary between what counted as fact, in regulating how facts were to be produced and evaluated, and to argue for the cautious movement from a factual register to conclusions about the nature of physical reality.
It's probabilistic reasoning.
It's probabilistic reasoning, and it got advertised as one of the representations of the scientific method, so that people could say Robert Boyle, with his air pump experiments in the early Royal Society, founded the scientific method. Of course, that's not the method used by people like Descartes or Isaac Newton. But what is important is that sense, that widely distributed legacy of sensing that facts are one thing, theoretical explanations are another, that you move inductively from facts to theory, and moreover, that you police the boundary between facts about nature and politics or religion.
So you
So
had to
that
be
science is,
you had to be disinterested, right? If you had
yes,
to,
you have to be
I mean,
disinterested.
it's funny. Like today, I mean, you know, we have these statements that everybody has to put in their um, articles now about where they got their funding from, and so
Exactly.
it sort of reflects the notion that you want to be disinterested, and then you're more credible, right?
Yeah, so insofar as this issue, which continues through to our times, what is the relationship between science and politics, science and business, science and the military, science and religion? That is the legacy of a conception of the relationship between solid foundational scientific knowledge and these disturbing things that worlds of value, worlds of subjectivity, that may or should have nothing to do with them. That's what's important about Robert Boyle. He doesn't invent this. This, as you say, builds on the legacy of Francis Bacon, but it mobilizes the sentiments and the energies of a large group of practitioners in and around the early Royal Society. That's what's important about Robert Boyle. He's very boring to read.
Mm-hmm. But there's this idea of, I guess, a code of honor or gentleman's approach to science. So all of these folks, they didn't they didn't need, I mean, it wasn't like a pharma company trying to convince you that their drugs are effective. So if you're a doctor, or, you know, you have an engineer, you're trying to kind of sell a client, right? You're trying to sell um, uh, a, you know, sponsor on the usefulness of your research, and you get paid for it, right?
Yeah.
So these guys, I mean, did you have to be independently wealthy in order to practice science? I mean, could you get funding? I mean, Francis Bacon had this idea that the government, right, was going to sponsor science for its own ends, right?
Well, as you said, I think the key notion is disinterestedness, which does not mean lack being uninterested. It means there's nothing working on me as a free actor that would induce me to deliver anything other than the truth. Yeah. So the relationship between the culture of giving scientific testimony and the codes of gentlemanly discourse resides in this notion of disinterestedness. Now, on the one hand, if you're a political actor or a religious ideologue, there are interests bearing upon your representation of matters of fact. If you were a tradesman, if you were under the necessity of keeping secrets to make money, your disinterestedness is compromised. So it's that middle ground. Now, a lot of these people were, of course, gentlemanly. Some were very wealthy. Others had the basic means to be free actors as gentlemen. But the importance of gentility isn't exhausted by being a gentleman, because it was a code, like we're talking about the language of humors and qualities and temperaments, that was widely shared. Disinterested truth speaking, and conversely, lying or accusing people of giving the lie, were understood outside the culture of people who had income sufficient to be free actors. You know, I make much of that, but it's not a claim that you had to be a gentleman to contribute to the scientific culture of the time. It's about a code that has its origins in the code of being a gentleman, where the foundational notion is free action. So you're a servant, you can't be a free actor because you're under the behest of your of your patron or of your master. And you're right. The declaration that we don't have conflicting interests reduces us, assumes that we're not free actors. Um, in modern scholarship, and not just in scientific and medical research. We all have to sign these things saying we don't have any interest to declare. I mean, I would like to say, but of course, too gutless to say, how dare you?
I mean, when you talk
It
about all
doesn't
the
work.
talk about the food research that's funded by McDonald's, right? And
Yeah.
the results that they come up with. But it seems like we still today, I mean, we trust each other quite a bit in the scientific and academic world. I mean, there's been a lot of scandals about folks, forging data. And I have a lot of colleagues who have co-authored articles with people who are accused of, forging data. And, I asked them, it's like, well, did you ever, go and double check that data? And they're like, no, of course not. I mean, you trust your colleagues. If your colleagues are within the academy, then you don't go and second guess the facts that they report to you from their
Yeah.
experiments.
No, trust is as it were the ground state.
Mhm.
It's the normal state. It's hard to imagine any sort of coordinated action, including the conversation we're having now, absent a ground of trust. Uh, even scientists say, well, I'm skeptical of everything. Trust the chemical constitution of reagents they use in the lab and the revolutions per minute of their centrifuges. They may check them from time to time, but the scientific literature overwhelmingly is taken on trust, maybe provisionally on trust. Yes, we can trust things that turn out to have been untrustworthy, but there's a foundational notion of trust such that absent trust, we would not have a body of knowledge. Converse, we would not have a moral order. So that notion of trust, I think, is important and foundational, which is not to say that we may not be having problems right now in the proliferation of untrustworthy claims in the scholarly literature. We evidently do. How much, I don't know. But the declaration of, uh, of, of interests is a symptom of that malaise
Mhm.
in our scholarship, which even now is uh, affecting the president of my university.
Mhm. Well, I mean, you studied in a department that was called the History and Sociology of Science, at Penn, and you said, I think it was in the Scientific Life, that history weighs lightly on contemporary scientists. I'm guessing sociology weighs just as lightly on them. Is that a feature or a bug? I mean, should we be concerned, or is that, in order to do good science? I mean, you really can't be thinking too much about that. Is there any reason why scientists ought to be aware of the kind of the mechanisms that they're practicing in a more conscious or intentional way?
No, I can't really. I mean, I would like it. I think. I mean, I still have this old-fashioned notion that to be an educated person is not to be a narrow specialist. Um, but I can't really say that anyone would do better science if they read history of science, much less sociology of science. And one of the first books I read, even before I was a graduate student, was, of course, Thomas Kuhn's
Hmm.
Structure of
Do people
Scientific
still read
Revolutions.
Thomas? People still read Thomas Kuhn? Do they?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I had to read it, I think, in three different classes when I was in school.
I taught it in three different classes.
Hmm.
But of course, Kuhn famously described science working well as narrow-minded. He used the notion of dogma to describe the socialization of scientists. Scientists uh, don't simply ignore the past; they ignore most everything outside of their field. And Thomas Kuhn was not saying that, of course, to criticize science, to point out the conditions for the nature of explosive scientific change. You were trying to fit the last piece into a puzzle. And to be narrow-minded, to be dogmatic was precisely the frame of mind that was needed, in his view, for the conduct of what he called normal science. And that made a great impression on me. I don't think it's an exhaustive or completely satisfactory account of the nature of science, if only because I, as I mentioned, have this allergy against people generalizing about the nature of science. But I did graduate work in science, and it seemed to describe my life as a trainee scientist rather well.
Well, I teach in business school, and I use the case method in some of my classes, and there's always a pushback on the case method because people wonder, why should I learn about some decision that was made 20, 30 years ago? And I always wondered what it would be like if science were taught using the case method, right? Here's what you know. Here's the prevailing dogma. What kind of experiment would you run? And put yourself in the shoes of Boyle. Put yourself in the shoes of Newton to see how you would think about these things.
Yeah. Well, there's really nothing wrong with the occasional dose of introspection. There's really nothing wrong with occasional getting out of the silo, as you would put it. Taken to an extreme, again, we know nothing. So there are two ways of knowing nothing. One is to be extremely dogmatic, and the other is to be extremely open-minded. I actually was taught, I went to a liberal arts college, and I was actually taught science.
You had to read, right?
I did. And it had a lot to answer for. I loved it. But a lot of science was taught through papers, classic papers, including genetics. Well, I went to graduate school in genetics. And we were, to a certain extent, taught to reason in terms of, here's a groundbreaking scientific paper. How did this author go about it? What kinds of experiments did he or she do? What kinds of inferences? What kinds of actual protocols were used? I found, however, that I actually went to graduate school. This was not considered a very useful way of going about things.
Right.
But the case method, which, by the way, influenced Thomas Kuhn very much, came out of the business school, Harvard Business School, by way of Harvard's then president, the chemist James Bryant Conant, and informed both Kuhn's teaching in the history of science at Harvard, and of course, the case histories of experimental science make up the stories in Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. So it comes full circle, in a way. A theory of the nature of science and scientific change is advanced through cases, just as at the business school.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stephen, this is really great. We barely scratched the surface of your research. There's so much work here, and I do hope that at some point you come out of the Bay Area and I can cook you dinner. We can drink a little wine in moderation, of course. But I look forward to the publication of this new book.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks very much for the opportunity. And if you're ever in the Boston area, similarly.
Everybody,
thank you.
Check this out. Eating and Being, a history of ideas about what we eat and who we are. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.